Good evening. How's everyone? Thank you. I would like to welcome you to a new semester. I would like to welcome you to our Krasnov event series. I'm Klaus Larres. I'm the Richard M. Krasnov Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm very pleased to report it's sunny again in Chapel Hill. After Hurricane Florence, we didn't expect that to happen too soon, but we are glad that the sun has come out again. We have a very exciting program this semester. Only in October, for example, we have two ambassadors coming. That is Ambassador Christopher Hill, who will talk about North Korea and the United States and China. And then we have the Irish ambassador coming, who will talk about Ireland, the EU, and Brexit, also a very topical issue. And then we have many other talks by very distinguished speakers, dealing this semester in particular a lot with China and Asia, but also, of course, with other parts of the world like Eurasia, Russia, Europe, and so on. I would like to remind you that we have a website, as you know, www.krasnovevents.com. Please check it out as soon as you get back home, please. And also, please don't forget about our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel is still up and running, and as always, we will videotape this event today as well as all our other events, and you can watch it at your leisure at home within a week or so of the event having taken place. And the address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC in one word. Today, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Joern Beissert of the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. Joern is a very distinguished diplomat who has been particularly around Asia an awful lot. He has had many postings in East Asia in particular, in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Taipei, and in Tokyo. And he's also a professional translator. He speaks fluent Chinese and Japanese, which impresses me a lot, I must admit. And it is great that we have him here at the German Embassy in Washington. He deals above all with security policy and also with relations with Asia. So he investigates for the German government what the United States do in Asia, what they do, how they perceive Asia, and of course American-Chinese relations is part of his portfolio. And as you all know, the trade war, unfortunately, is escalating. The world becomes ever more complicated. And the question is, how do the other countries position themselves between the United States and China? That is, of course, above all a question for the Europeans. Europe, like the United States, has important trade and political relations with China, and the trade war doesn't make life easier. So that's a very topical, very interesting issue, and we'll have lots of questions, which I'm sure we will ask to Joern Beissert at the end of his talk. So it's a great pleasure to have Joern Beissert here. Joern will talk for 35 to 40 minutes. Then I will also say a few words about my recent experiences at the German Embassy in Beijing. And then we will open it up to Q&A from you, the audience. Please don't hesitate to ask as many interesting questions as you like. We have plenty of time to accept your questions, and we actually look very much forward to having your questions. So thanks again for coming and attending our first Krasnov Events lecture this semester. And I would like to welcome Joern Beissert of the German Embassy in Washington, D.C.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Larres for this very, very kind welcome. And when he was mentioning what other distinguished speakers will be participating in this lecture series, I feel even more honored that I can be here. And then last week I was still worrying whether we would be able to make it because of Hurricane Florence. But frankly, I am quite surprised how good the weather is. I think we have at least 5 degrees more than in Washington, D.C. Today I will talk a little bit about the China challenge, the response from Europe and the US. I will also say a couple of words about the relationship between Germany and the United States, because as you know, Germany is also pretty much in the shooting range of President Trump. Therefore, we think we have to make a much bigger effort to preserve the transatlantic relationship, to improve and further deepen the relationship with the USA. And I think one of our countermeasures is to exchange more with people from all walks of life in the US, and therefore I'm very, very pleased to be able to come here to talk to all of you, to exchange views with you. I've heard that the University of North Carolina is the oldest state university in the whole country, and I really have to say it's an honor for me to be here. Well, talking about China, China is of course on the rise. You may have heard the quote by Napoleon, who is supposed to have said at the beginning of the 19th century, China is a sleeping giant, let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will move forward. And I think that is precisely what we're seeing now, and the fact that China is rising has considerable effects on the relationship between China and the United States, but also between China and Europe and China and Germany in particular. Of course, this also has effects on the relationship between us and the United States. I'll probably also start with a couple of words about myself. I've been in Washington now for a year. Professor Larres has already mentioned that I cover Asia, and of course at the moment this in particular means China and North Korea. I have to correct him in one respect, I don't investigate, I just observe. I don't have anything to do with intel work whatsoever. And before coming here, I had the pleasure to spend some 4 years in the People's Republic of China, both at the embassy in Beijing and at our Consulate General in Shanghai. Professor Larres has also mentioned that I spent some time in Taiwan and also some time in Japan. I should also mention that I'm a Zhongguo de Nüshu. My wife is from Taiwan. Zhongguo de Nüshu means a Chinese son-in-law, and that of course probably gives me a rather special, if not unique, perspective on China. Let me talk a little bit about perceptions first. I think the views from Berlin, from Beijing and Washington do differ. And I think that is not surprising, because we have different angles to look at China, we have different interests, and of course we also have different means to project political influence. When I came to Washington last year, I found myself in a much more China-critical environment than what we used to in Germany. If you look on the website of the State Department, for instance, they describe the relationship with China in a rather minimalistic way. They say, the United States seeks a constructive, results-oriented relationship with China. That's not very enthusiastic. And even worse, if you look at some of the policy papers which have been published by the Trump administration, it becomes quite clear that China is seen as an adversary, it's seen as a competitor in the national security strategy. It's labeled as a revisionist power and also put in the same category as Russia. And it also says that China is attempting to erode American security and prosperity. And it also says that the nature of the Chinese political system makes it a potential enemy of the United States. And that is a very dim view on China. Recently, there's also been quite a lot of discussion in academic circles about the relationship with China. And I think the word, or the two words, disappointed hopes probably describe it quite well. I mean, there has been an article by Mr. Campbell and Mr. Ratner on China reckoning, and another one, Did America Get China Wrong? And basically what these articles are saying is that the US expected China to reform, to open up, and to become much more similar to itself. And apparently this hasn't materialized, even though China has developed tremendously in the economic sphere. The political system has not reformed as much as many people in the West, and that includes Europe, would have liked to. Then also the economic relationship between China and the United States has become more difficult. The trade deficit has been mentioned. There is considerable worry about the Chinese investment in the United States, and at the moment we see this trade war which is unfolding between China and the United States, and we do not know how far that is going to move forward. Then also, if you talk to people in the administration, you find that there is a very strong anti-Chinese Communist Party current among them. People are experts in China. Some of them, my impression is, also really love or like China, but still there's this very, very strong criticism about the Chinese political system and the Communist Party in particular. Let's look at it from Berlin, or our embassy in Beijing. Also, the German and European perception on China has been evolving over these years. Originally, our focus was very much on the economic relationship and also on scientific cooperation. I think Germany was very enthusiastic about the possibilities that were opening up for Germany and the German economy in China. Some of the German car companies were among the first Western companies which were willing to invest in China on a large scale. And so I would say in the beginning the relationship was perceived as being useful for both sides, of offering tremendous opportunities for German business. It concentrated basically on business and economics. There was also a strong science component, and I think this perception is pretty much reflected in the earliest concept papers which were drafted by the German federal government on China. These papers concentrated on economic relations, on scientific exchange, and also what contributions Germany could provide for the development of China. Germany has concluded in 2004 a strategic partnership in global responsibility, as we call it, and this relationship was upgraded in 2014 to a comprehensive strategic partnership. We've had annual consultations with the Chinese government since 2011. That means the Chancellor and a large part of their ministers travel to Beijing and talk to the Chinese cabinet there, or vice versa. The Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang comes to Berlin and brings a lot of ministers with him. And this is rather unique. I think we're the only European government which has that sort of a framework, and even among our European partners it is quite unusual that we have such a close government-to-government cooperation. For instance, with the US, we do not have that sort of a government consultation mechanism, even though, of course, the relationships are very, very close and there is a constant exchange between two sides. In 2014, we also developed, together with China, what we call a common action framework, and this covers also foreign policy and security policy questions, but still economics, scientific cooperation, innovation, etc., in a way, are the main topics in this common action framework. And so our view of China was always much more impacted by the opportunities which China gave us. Recently, this outlook in China has been changing somewhat. I think also in Germany we have become more critical or more cautious, and that is due to the fact that the economic relationship between China and Germany is changing. If you now talk to German companies in China, about 10 or 15 years ago they were very confident and say that the Chinese will never catch up. We are 20 or 30 years ahead of them. If you talk to them now, they have to admit that the technological gap between Chinese companies and German companies has diminished. Chinese companies are now real competitors. They of course also compete on price, But it's not only the price which makes them competitive, also quality and technology have improved tremendously. And I think German companies now also take Chinese competitors very, very seriously. And of course take into account that there is no level playing field between Chinese companies and foreign companies in China. They're very worried what that means for their market share in China. There's also a lot of worry about Chinese investment in Germany. Germany, of course, like the US, is a very open economy, and we're probably even more open than the US. We haven't had an instrument like CFIUS, which checks up on foreign investment very closely and analyzes its security implications on the host country. And we've also seen some very high-profile investments in Germany, which really got people to think about how the economic relationship between Germany and China will evolve in the future. I think the most prominent example is the Chinese company Midea buying the German robot manufacturer KUKA. There was a big discussion whether we should prevent that. Eventually, the Chinese were able to buy that company, but this led to a situation where there is a lot of concern in Germany that Chinese investment in particular is looking at our technology. The Chinese investment is also looking at critical infrastructures, and that Chinese investment essentially is there to make China achieve technology advances in order to become even stronger competitors. And so now in Germany we have become much more critical and much more careful than in the past. I should also mention that part and parcel of the relation between Germany and China is also the EU-China relation that has also become much closer than it was in the past. China and the EU have regular summit meetings, and there are more than 60 sectoral dialogues on all sorts of topics. There is a EU-China comprehensive strategic partnership, and also a EU-China strategic agenda for cooperation, focusing on peace and security, prosperity, sustainability, and people-to-people exchanges. So the relationship or the perception of of China in Germany and in the EU is changing, but from the topics of all these exchanges, you hear that this competitive element plays a much bigger role than what you hear from the US government at this point in time. The EU-China relationship has its problematic aspects, but generally I would say it's much less confrontative as what you see between the US and China. I would also like to say a couple of words on how geopolitical trends are perceived in the US and in Europe as far as China is concerned. I think if you look at the US, there is a very strong military component. The US perceives, as it's set out in the national security strategy, as a military threat. There is what is going on in the South China Sea. There is the issue of Taiwan. China is perceived as a threat in a multitude of fields, including cyber, space, hybrid threats, etc. The US also has the impression that China wants to push out the United States out of the Asia-Pacific perimeter, and that China wants to create a Sino-centric world order. One of the instruments of that Sino-centric world order is the initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was devised by the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, where he's talking about the new Silk Road and where he wants to link Europe and China and the countries in between with an ever tighter infrastructural network, and many people also see this as a political instrument to establish Chinese domination over the country, at least in the near surroundings of China. The US has been responding to that with the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and is trying to establish coalitions in Asia against China. From the US, there's also a strong diplomatic pushback against China. One example is the United Nations, where China is trying to establish wording which comes from a Chinese context, like the common destiny of mankind. These wordings all have a specific meaning in the Chinese context, and the US is very strong at withstanding these terms being introduced in resolutions and other documents in the United Nations. The US is also pushing back very strongly as far as attempts of China are concerned, where China tries to also create its own international order. One example is, for example, the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Germany has become a member of that bank. The United States has not, and also has extended, has had quite a lot of pressure on its allies not to join this bank. Then, of course, the US also has this feeling that many things cannot achieve without China. I think the most important case in point is, of course, North Korea. In North Korea, if you want to make success, you need Chinese cooperation, and it seems that Chinese cooperation is also dependent on the state of relations between the United States and China. In Germany and in Europe, the discussion has been really focused on the Belt and Road Initiative. We also see certain risks, but I think at the same time we also see tremendous opportunities, especially for our companies, and our companies are very interested in participating in that initiative. We have also come up with a strategic answer to the Belt and Road Initiative, and that is the EU-Asia Connectivity Strategy. This strategy is still in the making. Just the day before, just yesterday, there was I would say, some sort of a summary about this strategy. It's called the Joint Communication Connecting Europe, Asia, Building Blocks for an EU Strategy. I.e., the strategy is not finished yet, but you already hear from the wording that the strategy also includes a lot of cooperative aspects as far as the relationship with China is concerned. One thing which worries us very much regarding China's geopolitical activities is the issue of EU cohesion. China, as a large power, is of course playing the game of divide and rule. In the EU context, that means that they have established another framework, what they call 16+1, one being China, and 16 a number of countries, especially from Central and Southeastern Europe. Many of these countries are members of the EU, but not all of them. And the reading of that in Germany is a rather negative one. We see this as an attempt to divide the unity of EU member states. And we've also seen in a couple of cases that China has successfully impacted, for example, declarations by EU bodies on issues that were of interest in China. One example is a declaration on the South China Sea. China could work on some of the member states with the fact that this declaration was significantly diluted, and this is of course something we find very worrying. I'd like to say a couple of words also on the economic relationship between China and the US and Germany, and especially how this relationship is perceived both in the US and in Germany or in Europe. I think in the US, at least from what I'm seeing in Washington, the discussion is very much focusing on the issue of the trade deficit. There are many other issues which are being discussed. Very often people mention IPR theft, China being a copycat, copying US technologies. US companies complain about a lack of market access. There is no level playing field, especially if they have to compete against Chinese state-owned enterprises. Now and then also the issue of US debt and Chinese ownership of US debt comes up. And I think one issue which I'm also hearing very often is that here in the US there are more and more people worried that China will challenge the dominance of the US in the fields of IT and telecommunications. And one thing which I'm hearing over and over again is the worry that actually China may surpass the United States in the development of 5G networks. The German perception or the European perception is similar, but still there are significant differences. I think in Germany the focus is really on China catching up technology-wise. I've already mentioned the KUKA Midea case. I think what really worried us is a strategy which was drafted by China, Made in China 2025. If you look through that strategy, the strategy enumerates a number of industries where China wants to become a first-rate country by 2025 in the automotive sector, in aviation, in the machinery industry, in robotics, in railway equipment, and so on and so forth. And from our point of view, that is quite threatening because these areas are precisely the fields where the German economy is strong. Not only Germany, also Japan and South Korea have probably similar worries. But I think this is really a question of existential importance for us. The trade deficit in Germany, on the other hand, is not a very important issue. We also do have a trade deficit with China, but the size is much smaller than the US trade deficit. And at the same time, of course, we have surpluses in trading with many others, including the US, which in a way balance that out. And so we are not really worried about having a trade deficit with China, and we think that is sustainable. Also, the issues of debt or, for instance, Chinese technological advances in the field of telecommunications and IT do not worry us that much because we're not really that strong in these fields either. So we have to look up both to the US and China in these fields. So probably that much about economics. Another area which I would like to touch upon is the perceived Chinese influence on our societies. I think in the United States, this has become a topic which gets more and more attention. The US is looking closely at Chinese influence in countries which have some similarities to the US, in particular in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. In all these countries, we have strong Chinese diasporas with all the advantages and disadvantages which will be associated to that. And my feeling is that the US is also especially worried about the Chinese influence in the education sector. Confucius Institutes are an issue which comes up again, and I think the general feeling is that Confucius Institutes can restrict academic freedom in the universities which they are associated with. And then there is also a growing financial dependence of many universities on Chinese students. And I have to say, I mean, I'm sometimes very surprised how Chinese many universities in the United States have become. Just an example, my wife's cousin studies at Johns Hopkins University, and she's participating in a program in which there is no single American, it's all Chinese. And 90% are from mainland China, and the rest is from Taiwan and Hong Kong. So there's not a single non-Chinese person in that course, and that is of course quite unusual. Another field where I think the US is getting more and more worried is what I would call the long arm of the Chinese state. The Chinese state is not necessarily respecting the sovereignty of other countries. They send their offices here, they look after Chinese groups in the United States, both in the positive and the negative sense. And so I think in the US there's quite a lot of urgency that something has to be done about that. I think one of the possible answers is transparency. The US is of course an open society, and such influence can be brought to light, and that can also play a role in bringing it under control. I think in Germany our perception is not nearly as we're not nearly as worried about that, and probably there's also only limited awareness about these issues. I think in Germany, for instance, as far as the issue of Confucius Institutes is concerned, we are quite relaxed. We do see that Chinese institutions also exert a certain pressure on professors, for instance, in order to make sure that they are not critical of China. We also see Chinese state influence being extended onto Chinese diasporas, and also groupings which are critical to the Chinese states in our country. I would specifically point out, for example, Uyghur groups in Germany. Germany is the seat of, has the seat of the Uyghur World Congress in Munich, and we are aware that China is also at least monitoring very closely their activities. And this also, of course, applies to other Chinese groups, Falun Gong, what have you. But generally speaking, I believe that we don't have this sense of urgency as there is here in the United States. We think that we have that sort of influence extension by China under control, and we also are probably not as exposed as the United States, because of course our Chinese diasporas are much, much smaller than here in the United States. And I think the Chinese interest in Germany is basically focusing on economic and technology issues. There is we're not really aware of China trying to have an impact on our political system. Well, I will try to draw a conclusion from all of this. I think in general we can say that the US is much more critical about China, and they're also much more worried about the rise of China and what that will mean for their own position in the world than we are in Europe. It seems to me, and again that's my personal outlook, that the United States has more of a zero-sum game outlook in China. The US is also much more determined to take action in order to impede a further rise of China. On the other hand, we in Germany and in Europe are adopting what I would like to call a more flexible approach. We are much more willing to accept the reality of a rising China, and despite difficulties and despite problems, we are willing to look and to search for opportunities which this trend will offer for us. The United States and Germany and Europe also in their analysis have a lot of overlapping parts, and and also a lot of common interests with respect to China. And I think that means that in dealing with China, there's also quite some room for cooperation between the United States and Germany and Europe as a whole. And I think one of the tasks of the embassy is, of course, look to trying to search where we could cooperate more meaningfully, but at the same time, I think this space for cooperation is, of course, limited by the different interests we have, by the different outlooks we have, and also by the different means we have to deal with these issues. And I find that at the moment, one factor which really sort of reduces this space for cooperation is the trade policy of the United States. Of course, it seems to be primarily focused on China, but at the same time, I think many other trade partners, Canada, Mexico, but also the European Union and Germany as the biggest economy of the European Union are negatively affected by that policy. And many of the steps which are pointed against China also affect us negatively, and of course that makes, let's say, a common approach a little bit more difficult. However, I do believe that there is some room for cooperation, and I think together with the administration in Washington, my colleagues in Germany, and of course also at the embassy in Washington, will continue to look for fields, for spaces where there's common interest and where we could cooperate meaningfully with the US in order to deal with the rise of China. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting and informative lecture. Just a few minutes from me, from my impressions, and I think I would like to agree that the interest in China, in Germany, is much less well developed than it is in the United States. That China is much less of a factor when Germans think about international affairs and global affairs, and may be changing, but at the moment I think we do not find that many regular newspaper articles about China, let's say on a daily basis. That is very different in the United States. One reason may be that Germany is really geopolitically much less exposed than the United States. So any activities by China in the geopolitical realm, be it the South China Sea or Africa or other countries and continents, I think the Germans tend to shrug off as they are not involved themselves. And that is of course very different to the superpower United States, which is engaged in almost any part of the world and is directly affected. So in a way they are much more clearly confronted with China's activities almost daily. And I also agree the Germans, or the Europeans I would almost say, have that naive belief perhaps that they have been better technologically for the last few decades and that they will continue to be better. I talked to the manager of Volkswagen in Qingdao, and who has had to have a joint venture partnership with a Chinese company. And so I asked him, are you not worried about intellectual property theft and knowledge being passed on to your joint venture partner? He said, sure, of course we are. And we know some of our knowledge is clearly being transferred to that partner, and from the partner it goes to the Chinese state. So are you not worried? Well, he says, you know, we just have to continue to be better. And we develop things in Germany which are more advanced, and then they steal it, and then we have to do another step and be better all the time. And of course, if that was possible, that would be kind of nice and handy, and then the conflict would really be easily resolved. But I thought that might not be the future. Because as we all know, the Chinese are not the China of the 1960s and 1970s. They have become a very well-developed country, at least in many aspects, and are actually very good in innovation. It is a myth to believe the Chinese cannot innovate, they can only imitate. I think that may have been the case decades ago, but today I think the Chinese are also very good at innovation, And one has to give them credit for that, but that of course causes lots of other problems. Anyway, I had a good time in Beijing. I first taught at Tsinghua University, at Schwarzman College. I taught a course, and which also was a very interesting experience. And then I joined the German Embassy for a little while, where I was involved in looking at trilateral relations, China, United States, Germany. And I wrote a number of reports on that, but I also was partially involved in the day-to-day working of the embassy. What I did notice, just from a daily sort of impressionist point of view, was that China, of course, is a different country when we compare it to, let's say, a Western country. For example, on a daily basis, access is actually much more limited and restricted to Chinese policymakers at all levels, be it the more senior ones, be it the more junior ones. It is very much more difficult to obtain access to officials, and only, of course, if there's an emergency or something really dramatic happening, then access also is kind of possible kind of immediately. But on a regular routine basis, it is, you wait, you ask, can we talk to this and this minister or vice minister or the director of European affairs and so on, and then you wait. And that is not the case the other way around. And that is what I believe European diplomats get quite annoyed about. If the Chinese ambassador asks for an appointment with the German minister, foreign minister, or the deputy minister, I would assume within 2 days he has an appointment in Berlin. This is not the case the other way around. European officials have to wait unless that really is an urgent situation. And that sort of reciprocity, or that lack of reciprocity, officials always complain about, and that makes life a little bit more cumbersome, let's put it that way. That also means that the role of think tanks in China is actually much more developed than in Western countries, because think tanks in Western countries, including in the United States, are more like academic institutions. They're similar to universities and their research departments. While in China, I believe many think tanks, not everyone though, many think tanks are very close to the government, and they have insights into government thinking, also impact on governmental thinking, and therefore they have a often, not always, but often a semi-governmental role. And I think that is both an advantage and a disadvantage, because you don't, it's easier to get hold of think tanks, but you don't quite know what the influence and the impact really is. It may be high, it may be less so. So that makes life certainly interesting, I would say. What I also notice is that the closeness of the so-called like-minded countries in a country such as China is more developed than, let's say, in the Western countries. And that, of course, has something to do with the system we are dealing with in China. It is an autocratic system, it is a one-party state, and the democratic countries, the so-called like-minded countries, do get together and consult among themselves and say, how can we proceed, what is the best course of action. There certainly is a lot of rivalry, economic rivalry among Western countries, but there is also a level of coordination which may not be that usual in other parts of the world. And I think that is actually very beneficial, that the like-minded countries often get together, either formally or informally, and talk about things and see what the best way forward is for all of them. And here I think the EU embassy, the EU delegation in Beijing has an important role as a coordination vehicle. And the German embassy in Beijing is very close to the EU embassy, and that is of course very handy. And of course that gives the Germans more influence than, let's say, embassies which are further away. I'm not sure if that is really true. But the EU delegation has an important coordinating role in Beijing, and I think that role may be absent in that exact way in other countries in the world. And I think the EU appreciates that, of course. What was the big turning point in German-Chinese relations was probably China 2025, that industrial plan that China developed in 2015, and also the whole debate about the new energy vehicles, also 2014, 2015, when China insisted or wanted to insist on the fact that all new cars from a certain period of time should, to a certain large percentage, should be run on battery. on non-fuel basis. And that would have discriminated against all outside car makers, as they were not in a position to provide that percentage as the Chinese demanded. And so they put up a huge fuss, and they actually got an extension. So that fuss was successful. But it opened the eyes of many German particularly, but also other foreign companies, what was coming, what was around the corner, and that the traditional car industry may not be able to compete on the Chinese market within 5 to 10 years' time. And as you know, for the Germans, the car sector is immensely important. If you take away the German car sector, let's say if it collapsed tomorrow, I think it would be a disaster for the country. It makes up, I would say, more than 50% of the German industrial output. So it is immensely important. And any development which endangers the car industry in Germany, or the export quality, the export drive of that huge and important industrial part of Germany, is of course of existential importance. And that was the reason why they kicked up such a fuss, and suddenly their eyes were open. They said, God, what is happening? And of course another example in the same industrial branch is the drive for networked cars, so that in the future you do not need a traditional engine, you do not need a traditional driver, the car is being driven from outside. And that networked capability may not be actually all that well developed in Germany, for example, but much better developed in China. And that really made them very anxious and opened their eyes that they had to compete in a different way. And the Industrial Plan 2025 was the kind of umbrella organization for all that. And that is, of course, also what President Trump is worried about. And I think so we can say that from 2014, 2015, Western relations with China have become more tense and less harmonious than before. And that tendency certainly can be noticed at many embassies in Beijing, including the German embassy, where there has been quite a critical attitude about developments in China. Not just in the economics field, but also in the political field, that there's less and less freedom, less and less internet freedom, for example. But also human rights is a serious factor. Human rights is less and less observed, is a serious bone of contention. And that, of course, has led to a certain less harmonious relationship. What we see with the trade war, however, is that China tries its best to increase the closeness to all other governments. For example, with the German government, with the European government. So the reaction of China to the trade war is also to try to find new allies and friends in order to perhaps gang up on the United States and do something jointly against the American administration's trade policy. That, of course, is only, I would say, partially successful, probably not successful at all, but I think the attempt to cozy up to many other countries in the world can clearly be seen and has increased since the trade war or the tariff policy has taken root. While I was in China, or at the embassy in Beijing, also the visit by Chancellor Merkel took place, which was very interesting. And we can talk about more about that perhaps later in the Q&A period. And at the moment, I think we are in interesting times. We don't know how the trade war can be overcome. There's much speculation about it. I don't have an answer, but perhaps Joern Beissert from the German Embassy in DC can help us here in the Q&A question period. Thank you very much. And maybe my first question to Joern would be, how will the trade war develop? Will it further escalate, or do you believe something like what people call a great deal between China and the United States is eventually in the pipeline, be it before the November elections or after?
Of course, I do not have the crystal ball in which I can look in order to answer that question. What I can say is that at this point in time, neither China nor the United States seem to be willing to give in. We certainly do hope that the President is the great deal maker and that he will arrive at a solution. However, at this point in time, we are affected, and that worries us very much. We believe, as an open economy, in the merits of free trade. We agree also that China has to do more work in order to deepen reforms, open up further, and give foreign companies a level playing field. We're worried about this trade war going out of control, because that will also very much affect the German economy, which is very export-oriented and which is also very exposed to China. We are also worried about our value chains. I mean, many German companies produce in the US, produce in China, send semi-finished products from China to the US or vice versa. And of course, all these connections are being endangered by that trade war. So I think it's fair to say we're worried. We hope that a solution will be found, and we hope that the President will get the deal.
Thank you very much. Very diplomatic answer. Do you think there has been a diplomatic outreach effort by China to overcome the trade war in other than economic respects?
Can you use the microphone, please?
Yeah.
In your response.
Can you ask that question?
Yeah, sure. Do you believe, or can you see that China is involved in an outreach effort to, let's say, to create more harmonious relations with other countries in the world, so to overcome the trade war, the effects of the trade war, other than in direct economic ways?
Well, I think China is certainly trying, and China is, of course, in touch, let's say, with the European Union, with individual member states of the European Union, and as you said, China is trying to find allies with whom it could form an alliance against the United States. I would also agree that whereas we have some common interests with China as well, I think the overlap is rather limited, and in the trade policy sphere, I think what China and we agree on is basically to keep up the rules-based order, to rely on WTO. But I think China would, of course, like us to go much, much further. I think China, of course, is also through its Belt and Road Initiative, through many other means, trying to increase its influence and also its influence over foreign governments, and of course that is also with the aim to be able to challenge other countries as well.
Thank you very much. Let's open it to questions from you. There's a question here.
Hi.
Hold on, wait for the microphone.
Oh. Should I stand up or just...
Why not?
Oh no, what did I miss that? So would improving U.S. investment in teachers and public education help improve the United States' standpoint in what's essentially a tech race?
Well, I mean, a good education system is the basis of technological advancement. I think the US has a pretty good system. It's a system especially which is very attractive also worldwide. In the university sector, for instance, many students come to the US, but of course more can be done. I mean, we from the German point of view always put a lot of emphasis on vocational training. We believe that vocational training is one of the reasons why we have a strong technological base. China is very interested in our vocational education, also in the US. Many German companies work together with state governments in order to do more in that field. And of course, education is the key, and education is also the reason why China was so successful.
Yes, please.
So, two quick questions. One, with the new administration, as It's my understanding they've been hollowing out our diplomatic corps, and many senior diplomats are retiring, younger ones are not seeing a path upward. How do you see that affecting, one, the U.S.'s ability to understand what's going on in other countries and perceptions of other countries of us in terms of our relations? And the second one is, it seems to me that in the past China has been a bit of a foil for Russia, do you see this joint military operation that they've just done as sort of something indicating that's less of the case now? Those two are not quite the foil that they have been.
Okay, let me start with the first question. Indeed, the Trump administration needed a lot of time to fill positions, and many positions are not filled yet. We've also seen that many senior diplomats have departed. One example is the Acting Assistant Secretary for Asian Affairs, Susan Thornton, who is very respected by European diplomats and who is a real China hand from our point of view. She left the administration and she doesn't have a replacement yet. I think in the US system, those political officials are very, very important. From a German point of view, it's rather unusual. We have a system which is basically 99% civil, what we call Beamte, civil servants. And I found it very surprising that these these political appointees do play such a role in the US system. If there are no people in these jobs, basically not much can happen. And so I think the fact that many posts are vacant is a problem. Having said that, I think in the NSC, in the Pentagon, and in the State Department, there are a lot of officials who are very seasoned experts on China. And I think many other countries envy the United States for having such a large pool of talent in that field. And I think one big advantage you have about many other European countries is that you have this strong Chinese diaspora. There are so many people who have an intimate knowledge of China, who speak the language fluently, who know the culture. I think no European country has something to that extent. So I think, despite all the problems, the US is very well placed. On the relations between China and Russia, I think both countries, in a way, want to team up because they both feel US pressure. And but of course, especially Russia probably finds it also quite problematic. I mean, Russia is of course a country which is militarily very, very strong. The Russian nuclear arsenal is only rivaled by that of the United States. But I think Russia has failed in modernizing its economy. It's essentially a power which can create problems, but it's not a power which can, in a way, develop world trends proactively. So I think in Russia, they need China, but at the same time, they're worried that in a relationship with China, they would be the junior partner. And I think due to the fact that, unlike China, Russia failed in modernizing its economy, Russia is essentially a military power only. Russia is bound to be the junior partner in that relationship, and I think that would be a problem for Russia as well.
Thank you. The lady here.
Yes, I'm interested in what you just said about the State Department and the positions that are still vacant. However, in this past week, I've come upon a presentation by our new Mr. A. West Mitchell, who only last fall was appointed the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. He is apparently only 31 years old. He's from Texas, from a prominent family. And I see that the way I read his presentation, which runs to about 5 pages of single space when I printed it out, is that it's very aggressive and feels very threatened by Russia and China. And he's calling for and feels very threatened that they are challenging our global hegemony. And I'm rather disturbed by this, frankly. And then I noticed in particular 2 years ago, what caught my eye was your Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who hit the news big time in June when he was saying, warning against NATO saber-rattling against Russia. And I'd be eager to hear what you have to say about it.
First of all, I can say that we know Wes Mitchell very well. He is young, but I'm not so sure whether he is as young as you'd say. I will have my doubts. He is he's the Assistant Secretary dealing with Europe and Eurasian affairs, so in a way he's our counterpart, and he also looks at the relationship with Russia. And what he quoted is basically reflecting the national security strategy. The national security strategy of the Trump administration sees China and Russia as competitors, as potential adversaries. It of course looks also at Iran and North Korea as rogue states which challenge the United States, and also of course sees terrorism as a danger for the security of the United States. So I mean, I think what he has been saying in the speech you've quoted is pretty much in line with the outlook of the administration, i.e. very worried and very strong on both Russia and China. Frank-Walter Steinmeier was our foreign minister at some point in time. He's now the president of the Federal Republic of Germany, i.e. our head of state. He is from the Social Democratic Party, and the Social Democratic Party traditionally has been following the concept of Ostpolitik, i.e. a constructive relationship with Russia. I think Russia is, in Europe of course, very, very close. It's a huge neighbor. We have an interest in a constructive relationship with Russia. I think German discussion on Russia has also been changing somewhat. I mean, among the older generation in the SPD, this Ostpolitik view may be dominant, but our new foreign minister, also a younger gentleman from the SPD, has a much more critical view of Russia. He has also given some speeches where he basically said we cannot ignore the changes in the security environment, we cannot ignore the way Russia is doing its foreign policy. Ukraine, Crimea, etc. also affect our security. So I think within the SPD you may have two generations: those who believe in Ostpolitik, and President Steinmeier is certainly one of them, and a younger generation which is willing to have a more critical outlook on Russia. In my personal opinion, I should say, I think, of course, we cannot ignore the changes. I mean, some people in the US sometimes call Europeans naive. I don't think we're naive, but our interests are also a little different, and we're much, much closer. So we're also, potentially at least, much more liable to Russian influence than the US is. So I think this discussion reflects this different geopolitical situation we're in.
Thanks very much. And of course you could argue the Americans have a thing about the Russians, don't they?
We have two things.
Yeah, and you know, maybe if the Europeans are too naive, the United States, I think, has the opposite attitude, that everything the Russians do is maybe too harsh. The gentleman over there.
Well, so I'm really glad that you touched on foreign direct investment in your speech, because my question has to do with foreign direct investment, but on the global impact of Chinese companies. So over the past several years, we've seen Chinese companies surpass U.S. foreign direct investment in Africa, particularly with large infrastructure projects from Chinese companies. This past July, New York Times posted an article where Chinese companies were investing in Argentina and building a 450-ton satellite that some U.S. contractors would say had intelligence capabilities. So what do you think are the impacts of Chinese foreign direct investment on U.S. and EU allies, particularly Africa and Latin America?
I mean, China being now the second largest economy in the world is of course investing also in many other countries. I think Chinese investment is probably different from other countries' investment, that much of it is driven by state-owned enterprises, sorry about that. And state-owned enterprises, in a way, of course, do also pursue economic goals, but not only. I think this is also true for many Chinese private companies. There is a very close link between big Chinese companies and the government, and even a Chinese private company can be expected to fulfill wishes of the Chinese government if so requested. On the other hand, Chinese investment has also its positive sides. I mean, if you look at Africa, you'll see that there's not only those big SOEs who may be investing in resources or infrastructure, there's also a multitude of very small, really private companies who invest in Africa and are willing to take risks which many European and American companies are not willing to take. And these companies also employ Africans. And so I think if one says Chinese investment is only bad or is a danger to our security, that is probably a little bit short-sighted. I think there are also potential benefits coming from Chinese investment. I think even in developed economies we see very constructive and very positive Chinese investment. We also see some investment which in a way is not only motivated economically in infrastructure, but I think the US approach is a very sensible one. Look at those investments and evaluate them on their merits. I've recently talked to a Chinese friend who was working for a very big Chinese multinational enterprise which invests a lot in Europe, in the US, virtually all over the world. And they have been saying that the worst thing about the current climate is that there's a lot of uncertainty. They do not exactly know what rules are applied, and this also has a negative effect on potentially beneficial investments. And I think it's a multifaceted thing. There are certainly those aspects which you have raised, but I think there's also a lot of benefits coming from Chinese investment.
Thank you. Let me see. Gentleman over there. Yeah.
Thank you for coming. What do you think of the assessment that in a trade war, the U.S. can apply more pressure to China than China to the U.S. because of the U.S.'s larger economy?
Well, President Trump always says, we'll see.
Gentlemen here. Yeah. Can I also encourage our Asian friends to ask a question? Sorry, I'll take your first. Sorry. You go first.
Okay. So with the U.S. Currently preoccupied with economics and some of our policies that have led many to argue that we have abdicated our role as a defender of human rights and democracy, I mean, there are other players that could play a part. I mean, Taiwan is a place that can be touted as a democratic alternative, but through marginalization by China and other issues, Taiwan hasn't been selling that so well. So in what way, this is actually to both Joern and Klaus, in what way has the EU and will the EU, and by extension the Auswärtige Amt, promote human rights and develop civic institutions in China?
That was very kind of you. Well, the Germans, as you may know, have that unique system of having political foundations. So every major political party has a political foundation, and these foundations are also active abroad. Some people say they are little embassies. So the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, to name but a few, they have branches in major capitals abroad, sometimes in other secondary cities as well, and of course in Beijing, and also in Shanghai, most of these foundations are represented, and they do civil society work. They don't do political work, at least not seen from a German point of view. The Chinese sometimes claim they do political work, but what they really do is civil society work. There's, for example, the Seidel Foundation from Bavaria. They are very active in agriculture and in vocational education. And no wonder the Chinese love them, because they do useful work from a Chinese point of view as well. Other foundations who are more looking at human rights, looking at civil society, maybe a free press, are of course more controversial among Chinese officials. But they still do that sort of work, and I think that helps the situation on the ground and Chinese society to open it up gradually a little bit, to make it, to provide support, to be helpful. Otherwise, the German approach, and I think that is not just a German approach, but also a probably common Western approach, more or less, is not to push human rights, for example, too aggressively and too openly, but to try to deal with things in a private way, like when major politicians are visiting Beijing, like for example Chancellor Merkel, human rights is always on the agenda, but not necessarily at the press conference at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, but in closed doors when she talks to Xi Jinping, to the Chinese Prime Minister and other officials. And that has, as you know, recently has led to some striking successes. Success is still not sufficient, of course. There are many problems which are continuing. China is not a democracy, does not observe human rights in a Western-style way. There are many, many hundreds, thousands of executions every year, which is totally unacceptable. To give an example, it's totally unacceptable to any country which is a member of the EU. So there's lots of work and which still needs to be done, and lots of room to be active. But I think they try to do within the possibilities what they can do. But one cannot overlook that the climate in China has become more difficult. That really since Xi Jinping came to office, maybe it really is a sign of weakness that the Chinese government is scared that tackling these civil society human rights problems may lead to domestic problems, that is the reason why they are so sensitive about it. So it's not a sign of strength how they, to become more closed and more repressive, but it's actually a sign of weakness. But we still have to deal with that situation, and the situation is becoming more difficult rather than easier, and that means these foundations I mentioned and many other institutions from many countries, not just Germany of course, have to tread even more carefully and more cautiously than in the past. But I think they do their best. Of course, some people say the best is not enough. We need more. We need a more aggressive approach. That is a matter of judgment, whether a more open, a more aggressive approach would really lead to greater success. Because that is what we need. We need more success. We need progress rather than humiliating China. That is not in anyone's interest to humiliate a country and then close door. You have to be very sensitive and very cautious when approaching these issues. But of course they should be approached quite right.
I would like to sort of correct the misconception that the Trump administration is not engaged as far as human rights is concerned. I mean, you're probably right in saying that the president doesn't mention human rights very often, especially when he's talking to foreign leaders of the Xi Jinping kind. But I think the US is still very committed in the field of human rights and is also cooperating closely with countries like Germany, but many other EU countries as well. I think that on many issues we have been cooperating very closely. One example off the top of my head is, for example, the case of Liu Xia, and I think Liu Xia was finally allowed to go to Germany, but I think it's fair to say that the US was also involved in this process and well, it's very much involved. I mean, human rights is a very wide field, and so there are certainly differences what several countries consider to be important. I think under the Trump administration, one of the key objectives is freedom of religion, for instance. That is also important for Germany, but probably not to the same extent as the Trump administration. But I think we consult with the US on all of these human rights issues. We sometimes do disagree. For example, we're not really convinced of the wisdom of leaving the Human Rights Council of the UN, because there, of course, the United Nations was one of the key proponents of human rights. And without the US, I think it's much, much more difficult for the countries who believe in human rights that remain. But I think the US will continue to play a very major role in that. We're consulting with them on many human rights issues. As far as cohesion in the EU is concerned, I think it's fair to say that there are some countries which are more vocal than others, and Germany certainly belongs to the more vocal ones as far as the protection of human rights is concerned. Our ambassador has been very open. He has been criticized by China quite strongly, but I think it's very important to raise issues, and as Professor Larres has said, the developments within China are worrying us. I mean, there's the treatment of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. There's the reduction of space for civil society in China. There are lots of issues which make us worry.
Thank you. And maybe I can just add, on the 15th of November we show a movie, a Tibetan in Beijing, so that maybe fits into that topic. So you're all welcome to come back for that. Yes, please. No? Yeah, Sarah. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Joern, thank you very much for the very interesting, very insightful talk. 你好. I don't feel too good about the trade war between US and China. On one hand, I don't know if the Trump administration have a very good strategy, and on what scale they should do the tariff increase against China. And in the meanwhile, Chinese government, it's not a democratic government, and also they look very seriously at saving their face. So I'm wondering how Europe, and especially Germany, can do to help to improve this situation, to help solve some problems, and to get this dilemma resolved. I think this will be good for US, for China, and also good for Germany to avoid any, let's say, economic recession, global economic recession triggered by this trade war.
Thank you. What we call win-win.
Win-win, right? To have a win-win situation. Thank you very much.
But I think it takes not only two, but many more people to tango on this one. I mean, of course, Germany being a power which is significantly smaller and less influential than both China and the US has only limited means to exert influence on both of them. I mean, what we're doing is basically to emphasize our basic understanding of how the trade system would be, and we always underline it is important to preserve the rules-based order in the field of trade, especially WTO. We believe that trade conflicts should be addressed within the context of the WTO, and at least in discussing with the Chinese side, I think they at least partially share that approach. At the end of the day, of course, it depends on the two big elephants in the room, and other powers only have limited means to influence that. But we certainly do hope that both sides are willing to talk and to work on these issues so that we come out of this negative dynamic. But
is it really possible for the Germans, if I may add, to even have a small mediating role? That essentially the Germans are on the side of the Americans in the issues at the heart of the trade issue, or is that wrong?
I think mediating role is probably going too far. I mean, we of course talk to both sides and we present our views to both sides, and the European Commission in the trade field is of course also an important actor. But I think mediating would be going too far. This is essentially the thing which has to be sorted out by the US and China, and I think the WTO would be the right forum to do that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Hold on, the microphone is coming.
So it's more a comment and a question, is that I enjoyed it first, of course, very much. I worry because so many different countries are becoming anti-China. In other words, I'll say that out, anti-China. Because I was in India, I found a lot of anti-feelings because they were scared that this is a big gorilla right in their backyard, front yard. Then you have Australia is now upset, Singapore is upset, Malaysia is upset, I even heard that Africa was upset, New Zealand is upset. So you're getting more and more countries now anti-China. And as Sarah just mentioned, China is growing. The people are now spoiled in the fact that they are getting bigger. Somehow, if the current government is destabilized, what is the word in for? Is there concern about that?
Well, I think there is a discussion about these issues in China, but of course China being an authoritarian state, there is no free discussion. But if I understand correctly, within China there are voices who find that this more pushy approach, which is taken by the leadership in international relations, is of course the reason for this pushback you mentioned in many countries. And some people prefer the old approach, which I think Deng Xiaoping started, and he basically said China can wait. China has time, and there is no need to push, and we have to make ourselves smaller than we really are. I think that is true basically for any great power. I mean, it's true for China, it's true also for the US. It's also true for a country like Germany in the EU. When you're dealing with small countries, or smaller countries, or less powerful countries, sometimes it helps to be less pushy, less demanding, taking care of the interests of those smaller countries, because that's the way you gain them as allies. And I think, in a way, this is the strength of the US. The US has a lot of allies. China has very few, and Russia has very few too. And so I think it often pays off to be less pushy, to be more accommodating to your neighbors. And I think in China this is also an ongoing discussion, and we'll see which view will prevail. I think there are people who are worried that relationship with Japan is souring. No need to mention Taiwan. The relationship with many countries in Southeast Asia is getting difficult. Of course, China can rely on those countries which are very economically dependent on it, like Cambodia and Laos and the like. but there is discussion in China, and we'll see how they will continue to project power.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for some remaining questions, and I'll take this gentleman and then this lady.
So can you comment on the response of China to the U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, I think what the Chinese leadership has been saying is this is the biggest gift that could have been given to China. And I think that is very true. The TPP would have given the US a lot of leverage and influence in Southeast Asia and beyond. In a way, I would agree with those who think that giving that up was a big mistake. And my impression is also that within the administration, people are thinking of alternatives in order to, well, not correct that mistake, that's for you. They wouldn't say it that way, but I think they also, many of them also feel that this was a wrong decision, and they're looking for alternatives in order to reduce the damage.
Thank you. You have a question? No, right, okay. I take you and then you. Okay.
Hello. I attended a lecture a couple months ago by Yukon Fong about China, and he said something interesting.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Can you hear me now?
That's right.
I attended a lecture by Yukon Huang about China, and he mentioned something interesting about Germany's relationship with China, which I'd like to hear your opinion on. He said that compared to the German government, the German people are very wary of China, and I'm curious about your opinion on this, if that's true, and how the German government rectifies this considering their close relationship with China.
There are certain studies about the image of Germany in China and the image of China in Germany, and these studies have been done for the last God knows how many years, and the result is always basically the same. The reputation of Germany in China is very, very good. The Chinese think that Germany is a almost ideal country, high technology, good cars, what have you, also a sensible political leadership. And if you travel through China, I forgot to mention soccer, that's of course also a very important factor. And if you travel through China and talk to people, you hear this very positive impression over and over again. I think also the Chinese government basically is very interested in a partnership with Germany, and I think there are probably several reasons for that. One being that we are no geopolitical rival. Germany is a relatively small country, it's an economic power, but let's say our military might is limited. And so we are not perceived as a threat. Other countries, which you may know well, are looked at differently. Interestingly, the image of China is different. And if you talk to Germans about China, well, they'll think about the human rights situation. They'll think about the environmental situation, and they also increasingly perceive China as an economic competitor, as somebody who threatens their prosperity and their very jobs. And even though China is trying its hand at political PR, public relations and public diplomacy, I think as far as the image of China in Germany, they haven't succeeded yet. I also have to admit that, let's say, the Chinese know Germany better than the Germans know China. And the image many people in Germany have of China is really outdated. I mean, people think of people in Mao suits cycling around on their Chinese bicycles, and China still only being the workbench of the world, China being a poor and backward country, and nothing could be further from the truth. And I think the image we have of Germany is partly due to a lack of knowledge, and it's not the right image, but it's negative, that's true.
Also lack of interest, I think.
I think there's significant cultural barriers to be overcome, and I think also in this current climate, I mean, if you look into German media, basically they report everything which happens in Washington, Omarosa, what have you. I mean, it's all in German papers and it gets a lot of attention, and the coverage of China is not nearly as close. And I think also due to the fact that China has this very image, there are relatively few people who are willing to work in China, who are willing to study in China, and we'll pay the price for that.
Thank you. So.
Actually, I have two questions. The first, you mentioned that Deng Xiaoping suggested that a large superpower make itself small to attract allies and to build trust with them. So my first question is, how much trust do we have between the United States and its smaller allies now? And the other question is, what's the impact of the Russian and Chinese maneuvers, military training exercise that took place recently?
I think I cannot give you an answer on the last one because I'm not a military expert, and I'd rather leave that to military people who know what they're talking about. As far as the first question is concerned, I try to answer it from the German angle. I think the US still, despite everything, has a lot of political capital in Germany. I mean, everybody with a little bit of historic knowledge will remember the role the United States played for Germany after the Second World War. Among those occupying powers, let's say, the occupation by the US was certainly the most benevolent one. The prisoners of war who ended up in the US, they really had the lucky draw, I mean, comparison with Russia or even France or so on. The United States was a reliable and indispensable partner throughout the Cold War. I mean, I just remember President Kennedy's speech in Berlin, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and so I think the US succeeded within very, very few years to turn Germany from an adversary into a friend, at least West Germany. I forgot to mention the Berlin airlift, already in 1948. We've just celebrated the 70th anniversary, and just 3 years after the end of the war, basically the US expended a lot of effort and also many lives in order to keep West Berlin free. I think we also remember the role of the US in German unification. I think it's no secret to say that, let's say, our French partners and British partners were not overjoyed. But it was essentially due to the strong support from the US that German unification was possible. And even though, of course, we also have disagreements, and it's not only under President Trump that there have been hiccups in the relationship. I just want to remind of the Iraq War. At that time, we also had a rather sensitive and difficult relationship. But all in all, I think a very large part of German political opinion still very much values the relationship with the United States. For many people, the US is also, in a way, we would say in German, as ein Sehnsuchtsort. You say that in English.
Place of desire.
Yeah, well.
What about the EU nations, for example, the Baltic states,
well,
especially after Helsinki? They must be quite nervous.
Well, I mean, they're nervous, and yet I think they rely on the alliance with the US even more than we do in Germany. I think They are, well, of course they're nervous, but at least, just as we see the relationship with the US as indispensable. I mean, European security, no matter from a Lithuanian or Estonian view, is unthinkable without the US, and that is also true for German security. So we think we need this alliance with the US, we need the transatlantic relationship. Of course, we would wish that sometimes it goes a little more smoothly, but at the moment, without the US, it's very difficult to conceive European security. And on the other hand, we also believe that Europe also provides something to US security. And so we want to play our part in preserving and also sort of deepening that transatlantic relationship. And I think many people in the US also agree with that. And when we talk to people in Congress from both sides of the aisle, very many do share this the need of the transatlantic relationship and are willing to do something for it.
Thank you. And of course, the NATO contribution is going to go up, isn't it?
Not as fast as President Trump's wishes, but it's going to go up, yes.
Let me ask you a question which we haven't touched upon tonight, is Taiwan, China and Taiwan. You're the expert, being married to a lady from Taiwan. So what is the future? Is there a smooth, gradual takeover? Is the status quo to be maintained for the next 50 years? What is the future?
You're getting me into trouble here. Well, first of all, I, of course, will underline our One China policy and the German. And, I think we have close ties to Taiwan. I think we also cherish the democratic transformation of Taiwan. The first time I was in Taiwan, that was in 1987. It was still a dictatorship. And it's really amazing to see how fast a Chinese society could develop into a very vibrant, sometimes a little rough democracy. But I think Taiwan is probably the example for a functioning democracy in a Chinese context. I think we do hope that both sides will deal with the issue of Chinese nationhood in a peaceful way. My personal opinion is that if China increases pressure, and this is also my personal observation if I look at my wife and her family, if China increases pressure on Taiwan unduly, that is not helpful for their own cause. I mean, if you look at public polls in Taiwan, where often the question is asked, are you Chinese, are you Taiwanese, or are you both? You see that when there is significant pressure from the mainland, the people who answer, we're Taiwanese, we don't want to be Chinese anymore, is going up. So pressure does not really further the goal of reunification, and we'll see what the leadership in Beijing will do. I think one of the reasons why German reunification was possible and also successful is because West Germany was an attractive model for East Germans. They wanted to join the Federal Republic. And I think in the Taiwan Strait at this point in time, we do not have a situation where what people in China call the Taiwan compatriots, there may be some exceptions, but in general, they don't feel, they don't have this wish to get reunified. I think in Taiwan you have basically two mainstream opinions. One is we want to become independent, and the other one is we want to keep the status quo. And so I think China will have to think of something else if they want to come that way.
Thank you very much. We're coming close to our final questions. I see these three ladies at the back. Any question has come?
Only smiles.
Anyone else? Let me.
Yes,
Yes, okay.
Should I ask it or?
Yeah, please, yeah.
So going back to Belt and Road earlier, there's been a bit of a focus on Turkey recently, and I think as recently as August there was a military deal between China and Turkey, as well as investment obviously in infrastructure projects. How does Germany view this, especially given the recent breakdown in diplomatic relations? How does the U.S. view this? Is it seen as somewhat of a security threat? And how would they look to approach it?
I think both with the US and us, Turkey is a difficult ally. I mean, you've mentioned Turkey's relations with China, but probably even more important are Turkish relations with Russia. Turkey wants to buy a missile defense system from Russia, and that is a very big concern for the US in particular. Both Germany and the US have had diplomatic exchanges with Turkey. I mean, there's this Pastor Brooms thing, which poisons relations with the US. Turkey has also arrested a number of dual citizens, Germans who also have.
He's from North Carolina. You know that.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, but the only thing I can say that both for us and also the US, Turkey is a very difficult ally, but at the same time it's also an important ally. I mean, the geopolitical position of Turkey is very important. It plays an important role in Syria. In Germany we have almost 2 million people of Turkish descent, and so we are working towards an improvement in the relationship, but it's not easy.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we have to thank you for a very good and rounded picture of the whole and entire world. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to talk to and to discuss with all of you. And thank you for inviting me to Chapel Hill.
You're more than welcome. You are asked to come again, please. Thanks for coming tonight. And we have the next session already next Thursday, next week. That is Bruce Jenderson of Duke, who will talk about peacemakers, not war, but peacemakers in the 20th and 21st century. I hope I can see you again next Thursday. Thanks for coming. Good night.